Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Khan, I'm the Lettings Director of the Islington office at David Astbury's. I'm thrilled to see how many people are here this evening to join us in what I believe will be one of the biggest changes in our industry for decades. The Renters' Right Bill, due to be enacted later this year, is a generational shift from what we know, what we're aware of, and what we've been privy to. It will highlight fundamental changes to how we let properties, how we manage them, and the overall compliance to what we have to adhere to day in, day out. But, and this is the key, with the right preparation, these changes will offer us an opportunity, not a threat. Here at David Astbury's, we've invested in training, technology, and we've invested in partnerships with companies like Good Lord, and the opportunity to have companies and solicitors here to offer us advice this evening. Tonight is about insight, preparation and confidence. So this evening, we're going to offer you a layout of how the night will pan out. First and foremost, we're going to have David Smith, a law firm partner, breaking down the Renters' Right Bill and its real impacts. After that, we're going to have a presentation from Adam and Harry within the David Astbury's senior leadership team. We'll then stop for a break. We're then going to welcome Maria from Good Lord to the stage with regards to highlighting new products that they're going to employ as we move into this change once the bill is enacted. And then from around 8 o'clock, we're going to offer a Q&A session for everyone to have an opportunity to present any questions that they may have that they'd like to put forward. And then finally, at the end, we're going to offer, well, you've all been entered into a raffle this evening, so there's an opportunity to win a few prizes as well on us. So to get the ball rolling, what we're going to do now is we're going to welcome David Smith to the stage. He's going to be our legal expert with regards to the Renters' Right Bill and what impact it's going to have on all of you as landlords and how we're going to navigate that. So if we could please welcome David to the stage.
Happy quite expert. Love that term. Hi, so my name is David Smith. I'm a partner in a firm called Spector, Constant and Williams, which is down near Oxford Circus. I've just been there a month. My wife has already stopped my credit card, stopped me going along Oxford Street shopping every day. And as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Renters' Rights Bill, and what that's going to mean going forward. It is undoubtedly a huge change in the sector. It's undoubtedly a huge change in the sector because, in fact, it modifies the Housing Act 1988, which still exists, but in a heavily redacted and rewritten form. And it's been the same since, well, 1988. So pretty much since I was in short trousers. So it's no, really, honestly, since I was in short trousers. It's been around for a hell of a long time. And we've got very used to it as a structure. Everyone's become very habituated to it. It's also, of course, a bit of a straitjacket on the sector because it forces everybody to behave in a very particularly same way, irrespective of the fact that since this all started back in 1988, the private rented sector has become a hugely wide thing, doing all kinds of stuff. When back in 1988, there was no private rented sector. There were almost no private landlords. There were almost certainly no letting agents. And everything was a rent act tenancy forever and was mostly owned by very rich people or by companies. So, and then since then, things have completely changed beyond what the government at the time envisaged. The Housing Act 1988 was intended to get like pension companies and stuff to invest in property, much as they do in Germany or France. And things changed entirely beyond what the government expected. And then the government, various governments in fact, made things so much worse because they asked landlords to do everything. They said, oh, how's students over here? Students never lived in private rented accommodation in 1988, nothing. Then they said, oh, but please also house people on benefits. They all lived in social housing in 1988. And then also families, and then also groups of sharers and everything else. And then it was all your fault as well for not doing it correctly. So the governments and various governments and of all stripes, of all parties, have tried to expand and ask the private sector to do more and more and more, and then criticise them for doing it. And now they've turned around and said, oh, actually, we want to change the entire structure. But we still want you to do everything that you were doing while criticising you for it as well, of course. That's very important. So one of the problems as well with this whole thing is there's a tremendous amount of nonsense being talked about it. And just like most people nowadays, I spend far too much time on social media. And then my social media is somewhat less interesting than most people's because it's mostly about being about landlords and law, which is probably not as cool as some of yours. There are very few cats pop up on my timeline. But a tremendous amount of rubbish about the Renters' Rights Bill does pop up on my timeline. And there's a lot of nonsense at the moment on social media and on purportedly landlord websites and from people who are supposed to know better. What's important to understand is that all parties agree about this. Conceptually, the current bill, that's a Labour Party bill, is almost exactly the same as the previous Conservative Party bill introduced under the previous Conservative government. And while Kemi Badenoch now rails against it, she seems to have forgotten that when she was in cabinet previously, she voted for it on more than one occasion. Apparently, she didn't mean to, she says, and she didn't agree with that, but she still managed to do it. So there's a bit of an uncertainty there. So the reality is that there's quite a lot of cross-party consensus, and while the Conservative Party now has found themselves trying to oppose it, more than half of it was entirely their idea and has been part of the Conservative Party manifestos and Queen's speeches since 2019, when Theresa May's government first introduced it. So it's not just even one Conservative government that's done this, it's multiple Conservative governments. So the reality is that quite a lot of Conservative MPs do, broadly speaking, support this legislation, irrespective of what the government on the front bench is actually saying. And again, people need to realise this is happening. I hear a lot of people saying, oh, the government will bail on this, they'll back away, they won't do it because the Conservative government backed away from it. That's not going to happen. This is an absolute ironclad manifesto commitment by the Labour Party. They've taken an enormous amount of heat from their activists for not getting it done more quickly, and they are doing this. This is definitely happening. It's definitely happening pretty soon. The fact there have been delays has got nothing to do with a lack of commitment from the government. It's got more to do with other pressures, like, wars and stuff that keep happening and distracting them from things. At least there hasn't been COVID to distract them. And all the amendments, a lot of people are writing about various amendments in the House of Lords as if they're a real thing. Just because an amendment gets passed in the House of Lords by a house that's controlled by the Conservative Party, that doesn't mean that the Labour government, who entirely controls the House of Commons, is going to accept that amendment. In other words, they're not. So I've seen a lot of stuff talked about various amendments that the House of Lords has forced through over the last couple of weeks, as if they're real. They're not. They're amendments the House of Lords has forced through over the last couple of weeks. The House of Commons will vote them down again, and that will be the end of it. They can go back to the House of Lords and vote for them a second time if they want, but they'll still be voted down because the Commons has a 2/3 government majority, so they can always control the overall shape of the bill. So any amendment that's not been introduced by the government in the House of Lords, or which the government hasn't expressly said they will support, i.e. none of them, apart from the government saying 4 or 5 amendments, just ain't happening. So it's important to bear in mind, and although the delays have caused uncertainty and there's been a feeling of on-again, off-again-ness, a lot of the talk that I've seen about this not happening, or that's this great YouTube video, this guy said, breaking news, the whole bill's being changed because of some House of Lords amendment that hadn't even been voted on, but which he'd read about. This is not how the government works. So most of this stuff isn't happening. The bill, as originally drafted by the government and as originally put by the government, is broadly speaking what you're going to get. The only question about it now is timing, and that's quite important because the timing is quite tight. The government is very committed to doing this. They've taken an enormous amount of heat for doing it more slowly than they promised. Angela Rayner, during the general election, said they would get rid of Section 21 immediately. This was probably an unwise promise because it's very difficult to do things immediately if you're in government. But they're trying to do it as quickly as they can. But the problem they're now about to face, of course, is that in October, there's a Labour Party conference full of young Labour activists who were promised they would get rid of Section 21 immediately, largely in order to get them to come out and get the vote out on the doorsteps. And a year later, where is it? Where's the delivery? So there's a real problem for the government now, and they're under a tremendous amount of pressure to actually deliver, well, anything at all, frankly. but something that they absolutely committed to. So they're under a lot of pressure to get this done quickly, and that's a bit worrying because obviously it means that they may not think things through. But at the same time, it's important to bear in mind that there's a lot of doom and gloom talked about this, and inevitably I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to say the world is ending and it's so miserable and it's awful, but that's because none of you guys ever call me up to tell me how great your current tenancy is. No one ever calls me to say that. They always call me up and say things are terrible, I need you to evict my tenant, which is very depressing from my perspective. But that doesn't mean you should all call me and say this, I hasten to add. I was actually recently, so I said, well, we can all call you tomorrow and tell you how great things are. And there were like 150 people there, like thinking about writing down my phone number. I was like, all right, don't worry about it. But the reality is, nothing's actually changed. The law is the law, but the economics of the situation don't change. There are more tenants than there are available houses. You own houses. People want to rent them for money. Rents are still going up. They're going to go up faster. They're almost certainly going to go up a lot faster, in part because of this bill. The government is not introducing rent control. It won't do it because it won't interfere with the market that much, contrary to what people have suggested. There is certain rent stabilization measures in the bill, but they're not rent control. Market rents are still allowed. So the reality is that the basic fundamental economics of supply and demand don't change, and it's important to bear that in mind. For many, many landlords, nothing in this bill is going to make the slightest difference to you because it's not really aimed at you, because you basically do what you're supposed to do. The very fact you've turned up here probably implies that A, you're interested in the legislation and what you're doing, that you're likely to use a professional agent, and that you probably keep your properties in repair. Now, people who aren't in that category don't tend to rock up here of an evening when they could be doing something else instead, probably involving a lot of alcohol. Yeah? Or a baseball bat in their tenants, either or. I know some of you are really getting into the alcohol as well, but that's 10, okay? But the basic facts of the situation remain unchanged, and it's probably not going to alter your world as much as you might fear. So obviously the most important part about all of this is Section 21 goes away. So there are no fixed term tenancies, there are no Section 21 notices. All tenancies become open-ended from day one. There's no 1-year tenancy or 6-month tenancy, and there are no ASTs. All tenancies are now called periodic assured tenancies. And in principle, tenants can stay for life unless you have a specific reason to remove them linked to a specific event. Now, in some senses, this is not a bad thing because then you don't have to pay letting agents to find tenants. So, you should pay them for stuff. But the reality is that the government's objective here is that tenancies will actually last longer. Yeah, and that people will stay in properties longer, which is not really a bad thing because it reduces the amount of void periods. Now, I don't know whether the government's right about that. The reality is that most landlords didn't end tenancies anyway. The vast majority of tenancies in the southeast end because the tenant wants them to end at roughly 2.8 years in London and slightly more outside London, just over 3 years outside London. So there's some question as to whether this will really alter things at all, but the theory is that tenants will stay longer in property. They might not. But in principle, everything becomes open-ended and tenants can in principle stay for as long as they like. Any attempt to grant a fixed-term tenancy or suggest you're granting one is a criminal offence, and you could be subject to a civil penalty from a local authority. One of the big fears for many people in my position about this is I still get at least one phone call a week from a landlord who is blissfully unaware that there is such a thing as tenancy deposit protection. If that's any of you, this is not good. Which has been around since 2007, which is quite a while ago. I'm of an age where everything after 2000 is kind of recent, but the more I think about it, actually 2007 is quite a while ago. So the fact that people haven't got their heads around that worries me a little bit about all those people out there who've got some tenancy agreement they downloaded off the internet or got from WH Smith for 1 year and keep re-photocopying it and just stuffing it out at people who never interact with events like this, never watch the news, never read newspapers, have no idea about the law, and how are they going to find out that they can't keep doing this stuff? And the government's quite worried about that as well, actually. The other thing that's quite complicated about all this is that there's a D-Day aspect to it. all tenancies are going to immediately convert. Existing tenancies and new tenancies will immediately convert on some day yet to be established, probably early next year, into magically renters' rights bill compatible assured periodic tenancies. So you might think you've got a 1-year fixed term tenancy, but suddenly you won't have one. You'll have an open-ended tenancy. And that involves quite a lot of hassle and paperwork, and obviously, annoyingly from an agent's perspective, retraining all of your staff, changing all of your computer systems and everything, all for some putative fixed date. Now, this is a dangerous strategy because the government has done it in Wales, and it hasn't gone entirely well in Wales. And Wales has full landlord licensing and theoretically emails every landlord in Wales about all of this. And I still hear stories today of letting agents who should really know better because they have compulsory training using AST agreements, even though there's no such thing in Wales and hasn't been for 2.5 years. So again, a little bit concerned about this. So there's a logic to it, which of course is that you put everyone on the same system at the same time and you don't have different systems operating in different places. But it's also quite annoying from a management perspective, and it's important to have someone who knows what they're doing to help you with that. The other thing that's a big change, and is probably quite fundamental for a lot of people, is the way rent is structured. So it's common at the moment for people to have different rental periods, and if you're unsure of your tenant's financial probity, you might ask them to pay 6 months rent in advance, for example. It's quite a common structure. The government has banned all of that. The only option is to take rent monthly or less. You probably won't want to take it less, but obviously people sometimes use 28 days because it aligns with housing benefit or UC housing element payments. But you can't go longer than that. So you can't have 6 months rent in advance or anything that looks like it. And doing that is actually an offence. Tenants can volunteer the money to you, and provided it's not the first month's rent, you're allowed to take it. But what you're not allowed to do is force them to do it. Now, there is a recent adjustment to this from the government, which says that anything that currently exists, if you have a current tenancy with 6 months rent in advance structured that way, you can keep taking the money through that structure. So you don't have to change anything about your current tenancy, but any new tenancy will have to be monthly only. The other thing that's a bit of a concern is that you're not allowed to take any money before you've signed the tenancy agreement. So it's pretty common, if you get into the weeds of how letting agents and people work, that a letting agent will normally say to a tenant, this tenancy is subject to contract, and we won't sign it until you've given us the deposit and the first month's rent. And as soon as we see that in cleared funds in our bank account, agreement signed, you're ready to go. That's not going to be possible. You're going to have to sign the agreement, guaranteeing that the tenant can move in, and then take the money and hope it actually appears. But even if they don't pay the money, you've still signed the contract and they're entitled to move in. So there's a bit of a challenge there. Now, one of the things that's really useful about this is there are a number of products, one of them you will hear about later, that are going to help mitigate against some of this stuff. And this is where a really well-organized agent who's really thought about these issues can start to mitigate the open risk that's created. Because obviously the risk profile totally alters. And one of the things I think is really interesting about this that the government just hasn't thought about at all is that they're failing to appreciate that you, generally speaking, have a choice about who you let to. And the more that they change the risk profile, the more you will exercise your choice in a different way. And the consequences may not, in fact, be what they expect or want. Now, there's an aspect to which I think the government is kind of planning to use all this to buy itself a bit of time on the putative belief that lots of new social houses are going to appear on the market in the next year or so. But if you follow the headlines, you'll see that's not going quite as quickly as the government might have hoped. Oop, going the wrong way. The other thing that's quite complicated about this is marketing. So there are new rules about bidding, which the government has copied lock, stock and barrel from New Zealand. They were copied from Australia, but Australia has actually just repealed its legislation on this, so we copied them from New Zealand instead. It's not actually a really good way to write your legislation to copy and paste it from other countries, but apparently that's what we now do here. So when you rent a property now, what you will have to, under the new regime, what you will have to is put a price on the marketing. And that is the maximum available price that you can accept. So what, of course, tends to happen in London at the moment is properties are marketed at a price, and if they're quite desirable, tenants will bid more than that price, often bidding against each other, and you will say thank you very much, and you will take the highest reasonable offer from someone who sounds relatively sensible to you. That will not be an option. The maximum price is the price you put on the advert, and you can't take more than that. Now, an obvious solution to this would be to advertise every property for £1 million. I mean, some of you may be in that place, in which case, well done you. But for the rest of you, you might think, well, I'll just put some really fabulously high price on it, and there we are. But the problem with that, of course, is twofold. One, if you advertise your property for £1 million, it will never show up on anyone's Rightmove search because it has price banding. So you need to try and put it within a banding that's going to work. And two, of course, people will look at it and think, I can't afford it, so they're not going to make an offer. And the other problem, of course, is that there is also a provision that allows tenants in the first 6 months, and there has always been a provision, it's just never used, but the government's intending to reinvigorate it, that will allow tenants to come along in the first 6 months and say, the rent is above the market level. And so I want it reduced, and that reduction needs to be backdated to the start date of the tenancy. So simply taking a vast amount of money from someone who's prepared to offer it to you may not in fact be the brilliant wheeze it appears, because they may in fact be offering you the money with every intention of simply going and asking for a reduction in a month's time. And so one of the problems with this is that the data also gets distorted, because obviously people are going to, instead of putting current situation on where you put a reasonable price on, but you may well get offers above that price. So people might actually put a slightly middle of the road price on, fairly confident they're going to get more money. You're going to put a top whack price on everything, which means, of course, that the data on portals becomes distorted and is actually not a very good indicator of where the market level is actually at. And I know there are people who are going to talk a bit more about this issue later, because there are technical solutions starting to appear to this issue. Again, access to good knowledge is going to be really critical here. And it's one of the really interesting things, I think, about local agents, is they're going to have access to this kind of local knowledge that just won't be available elsewhere. Rent increases. Currently, if you want a rent increase, what you probably do is you sign a new fixed-term tenancy with a higher rent. That's not an option. So rent increase clauses, agreed rent increases, none of these are possible options in the new system. You will have to use the existing Section 13 increase process by serving a notice giving the tenant 2 months' notice of your intention to increase the rent. And during that 2-month period, they are then entitled to appeal to a tribunal on the basis that your increase is above the market level. Now, the problem from your perspective of this is that it's always worth appealing to the tribunal, because the rent increase is not backdated if you appeal to the tribunal. It's set for the next date that the rent was to go up, was to be paid after the tribunal date. And although the government says that the tribunal deals with everything inside 2 months, that's not actually true, because it takes 4 months before the tribunal processes the paperwork for the application and then starts to deal with it over the next 2 months. So the government's figures are true depending on when you consider the start to be. I consider the start to be when I sent my papers to the tribunal. The tribunal considers the start to be when they got round to processing my paperwork and asked me to pay the fee, which is a very different date. So the problem here is that lots of tenants might simply refer stuff to the tribunal, and relatively few do at the moment, but about 9,000 rent increase appeals go to tribunal every year, many of which are essentially blank forms with just the tenant's name on the top and the address, and I don't agree scrawled across it, and a Section 13 notice stuck in it. So one of the problems here is that it might go up radically, and all tenants will turn around and constantly defer these things on the basis of getting a delay, and so all rent increases are deferred. The other problem, of course, is what's the market level? At the moment, market levels are normally assessed by comparable properties or by looking on Rightmove. But if all the Rightmove data has been messed around because you were all marketing your properties at the wrong price, or a higher price than the actual price you got, it's really, really hard to work out what the right level is unless you have a data source that's going to tell you what the actual rents being paid are. The other problem with all this is you can't agree an increase until you've served the Section 13 notice. But you can agree an increase after you've served the Section 13 notice, as long as it's for a slightly lower sum than on the notice. So one of the really great strategies to deal with this is to serve a Section 13 notice on a tenant with evidence of why it's a fair price, but then say, tell you what, sign this and we'll take 90% of this now and we'll all move on. And the reality is most tenants are likely to accept such a structure. So it's having the right structure in place to make all of this operate. The government has actually suddenly realised this may be a mistake, because they did actually table one of their own amendments in the House of Lords, which allows them to make regulations to backdate the increases if they want to. But at the moment, they're not going with it because they say it won't be a problem. But I actually know the lady president of first-tier tribunals, and she's extremely annoyed about this because they haven't given her any more money to run the whole thing with, which is quite important if you run the court service. It will be compulsory for every landlord to join a PRS database. You can call it what you like, but it's a national landlord register. I don't personally consider this to be terribly complicated. The fee is obviously a concern. The government has intimated it will be about £40 to £50 per property every 3 years, which is actually pretty much in line with every other part of the UK. So I don't really consider it to be a big deal. What does concern me is until you've joined, you can't market your property. Now, this may not be a problem because it might be a bit like signing up for, I don't know, a car hire. I sign up for, I'm going to Heathrow next week and I need to park my car. I filled in a form online, took my payment instantly, sent me a payment confirmation less than 5 minutes later. If it's like that, it's not a problem because you'll do it all online, you'll fill in the data, bang, you'll get your confirmation, you'll get your reference number, you'll market your property. Alternatively, it might be like my last passport application where 3 months later, I sent a letter of complaint to the passport office and the passport turned up a few weeks after that. And if it's like that, that means you probably can't market the property until it's done. So there's a bit of an uncertainty about how efficient this is going to be and also where the process is. I mean, it's a government IT system, so, you know, government IT systems don't have the best record of being actually usable, but we'll see. What's important is that agents are going to be able to do this themselves on your behalf, which is helpful, saves some of the admin. And what you will also have to do is not just join a database, but you'll also have to join the landlord redress scheme. So at the moment, there is a redress scheme for agents that agents must join, but landlords will also have to join a scheme so that basically your tenant can complain about you. There is some uncertainty about how much complaints there'll be. At the moment, tenants don't complain about agents to the agent redress scheme. The only people who really complain about agents to the agent redress scheme, sorry guys, are landlords. Mostly about the fees they're being charged, ironically, or bad communication. So it's uncertain how much of an effect this is going to have, but it's the government's way of trying to move stuff out of the courts. But again, you have to do it, and you can't get possession of your property if you haven't done it. So these are going to be quite important things. At the moment, the government is suggesting a fee of about £10 per property per annum for the redress scheme, so it's not a vast amount of money. If it stays that way, £10 seems pretty low to run a redress option to me. As already said, tenancies are open-ended from your perspective, but tenants, of course, can give notice at any time, but the notice period has been increased from 1 month to 2 months, so they must be able to give you 2 months' notice, or any shorter time you elect to agree with them in writing. I can't imagine you would agree a shorter period in writing, but of course it's up to you. You can't specify how the notice is to be given, but you can specify to whom it is to be given. So they can give notice in writing by WhatsApp or text or email or just a letter, but not by swearing at you down the phone. But it has to be in writing, but writing is increasingly a wide spectrum thing. There was actually a case just in the High Court a month ago in the UK where a construction contract was concluded via WhatsApp exchange, much to the annoyance of the person who didn't think he concluded a contract. And last year in Canada, a construction contract was concluded by a WhatsApp thumbs up emoji. So writing really is getting quite a wide deal in the courts these days. The other thing that is very concerning about all of this is it has always been the case that in a fixed term tenancy, if you have a group of tenants, they have to give notice together. But in a periodic tenancy, one tenant can give notice to bind all of them. And the government's not going to fix that. So if you have a group of tenants, any one of them can give notice that will be effective for all the tenants. And the area this is a particular concern is with students who basically all fall out after 4 months. and one of them says, I hate you all and wants to leave, in practice at the moment, what tends to happen is the parents get involved and say, well, you should let my son/daughter go, it's not fair. And they get told, well, they can go if they like, but they still have to pay the rent. But you won't be able to do that. They'll be able to destroy the tenancy for everybody. So there's quite a complex problem there. Its level of problemness depends. In a London market, it's not a particular problem because you'll just rent it to someone else. But if you're a student market in, say, Lancaster, where it's students, or other students, your options, if everyone leaves in December, are quite difficult. Possession. Obviously, there's no Section 21 notices, so the Section 8 notice that's currently used primarily for rent arrears will cover everything. There are lots of grounds for possession, so there are already quite a few grounds for possession. There are now like 28 grounds for possession, so my poor little brain is being taxed trying to remember all of them. But all the notice periods are a bit longer. Obviously, they're specific as compared to Section 21, which covered a whole multitude of sins, and a lot of them involve the court indiscretion. But there are blocks on possession for not protecting your tenancy deposit, and obviously for address and database membership, and speed is one of the really big worries at the moment. So the government is claimed it's going to speed up possession, but it just went up by 2 weeks last quarter. So it's up to 36 weeks to get possession instead of 34, which is what it was previously. The government claims it's going to reduce that, but there is some skepticism around this. But the obvious point here is try not to get into this situation in the first place, because good, well-managed properties where you've got a good relationship with the tenant tend to have fewer problems. So there are specific grounds, for example, to allow you to reoccupy the property yourself. This has been widened, so you can reoccupy it for yourself to live in, or your spouse to live in, or your children to live in, which was not allowed before. But you do have to mean it, because unwisely, when this was first introduced under the Conservative government, a number of landlords stuck on social media, oh, I'll just tell my tenant I'm planning to reoccupy it, but I'll be lying, and I'll just relet it. Surprisingly, government ministers also read social media. This may shock you. So unsurprisingly, the government then built in an anti-avoidance mechanism. So you have to give 4 months' notice if you want to use this ground, but you can't give it until the tenant's been in the property for 12 months. So you can give the notice at month 8 for month 12, but they get 12 months of the property guaranteed. And once you give the notice, you can't market the property for reletting or relet it to anybody on any basis from the date you give the notice until 12 months after the notice expires. So the 4-month notice period plus another 12 months, 16 months total. So you really ought to mean it if you're going to put people in there. And if you lie about it, you can get a civil penalty, and they can ask for their rent back for up to 24 months. So lying about it is not a good plan. But it's a useful mechanism potentially if you've got children and you might want to let them move into a property. Likewise, there is now a ground for sale, so you can repossess your property if you wanted to sell it, but the same rules apply. So one of the problems that I tend to see a lot at the moment is an awful lot of landlords put their property on with an agent and say, well, I'll take a sale or a rental, whichever comes first. About 25% of those go on for rental again. You won't be able to do that, because if you evicted a tenant saying you're going to sell, you're locked out from renting it for 16 months from the date you serve the notice. So if you don't sell it, it's going to be empty. And there's nothing you can do about that. You're just going to have to suck it up, which means, of course, potentially you've got a mortgage to pay and insurance to pay. In fact, you'll be in violation of your insurance because it'll be empty, and bills to pay, and higher rate council tax to pay because it's an empty property. And you can't do anything about it because you can't let it unless you want to move your kids in there or go and live there yourself. So one of the things that I keep saying to people at the moment, an awful lot of landlords, when they choose to have a number in their head, which is based a lot on hope, it needs to be based on reality. Because if you don't get your number, you're going to have an empty property. It's your choice. But there is a structure. Now, there is a flaw in all of this, and I suspect lots of people are going to take advantage of this. If you never serve the notice, and you simply say to the tenant, tell you what, I need to get this property back to sell it. I know this is a terrible inconvenience for you. How about I give you back your full deposit and £1,000, and you leave within the next month? Yeah, fair's fair? That's fine. And if you then change your mind and don't sell it, that's absolutely fine too. You can relet it because you haven't served the notice. Now, I think this may sound to you, why would I give to my tenant money? That'd be terrible. But actually think about it logically. If you're a tenant and the landlord has been doing lots of viewings, and one of those viewings keeps happening, the same people keep coming back, so they're kind of interested, and then the landlord serves you the 4 months notice, what would you do? You might wait your 4 months, and then you say to the landlord, you know what, I'd really like to move out. And I found this other property, but it's so expensive to move these days, and it would really help me to move if you just gave me a few £1,000s. What are you going to do? Either you're going to go to court for 7 months, which is roughly what it takes to get possession back, or you're going to give them a couple of £1,000s to procure the sale. So you may as well just live with it and do it up front. Discrimination. There are new rules on discrimination. It's unlawful to discriminate against prospective tenants on the basis they have children or are likely to have children living with them or visiting regularly. I'm kind of hoping that most of you don't do this. It will also be completely unlawful to discriminate against people on the basis they're on means-tested state benefits, which I know a lot of landlords do. Any clauses in your insurance policy or your mortgage or a superior lease that require you to do that are of no effect, unless it's an insurance policy that predates the Renters' Rights Bill that has not been renewed or extended. And there aren't many that have these clauses in anymore anyway. So it's very difficult to restrict on this basis. Obviously, it's perfectly reasonable to discriminate where it's sensible to do so. So nothing requires you to break the law. So if you have a 1-bedroom flat and a tenant comes along and says, I want to live here with my 10 children, that's illegal. It was always illegal because it's statutory overcrowding. You can still say no, notwithstanding the fact you're saying no to children. Okay, so there are limits to this. And you can also still consider income. So someone can't turn around and say, I'm on means-tested state benefits, and that's still below the rent, and then accuse you of discrimination when you refuse them. Now, in practice, I don't think this matters because very few landlords do discriminate in practice. And if you've got 5 tenants, all of whom come before you, and they're all kind of the same, but one's on means-tested state benefits, who am I to say why you picked the tenant? As long as you don't say anything, I didn't say anything, I don't know. It's very difficult to prove. But you do need to be careful because the state has the power now to civil penalty you for breaking the law, and it's not tested at the criminal standard of proof. It's tested on the civil standard of proof, i.e. 50-50 chance. So on the balance of probability you are discriminated. So it's best to have a reason, but you're not obliged. I'm over. Lawful to advertise properties as no pets. This is complete. A lot of people think that you can't say no to pets. You absolutely can. But once a tenant has come in, then you can't refuse a pet unless it's reasonable for you to do so. Okay, and it's quite difficult. The only way that you can refuse is if you have a superior lease that says no pets, and you've asked the superior leaseholder and they've said no. So if you own a flat that's in a block that has a no pets clause in the lease, and you also happen to control the management company because all of the leaseholders own a share of the company, and you say no, that's absolutely fine because that wasn't you, that was the company that said no. That's okay, but any other circumstance, it's going to be very difficult to say no. All tenants have to have a written term of their tenancy. The government's going to specify this in regulations. Eventually, all tenancy agreements will have to change, but you won't have to repaper existing tenancies. What you will have to do is provide a leaflet within a month of the legislation coming into force that the government will prescribe. So there's quite a lot of admin to deal with there. And there are penalties for getting it wrong. The government is also going to introduce the Decent Home Standard, which is a prospective standard requiring properties to be up to snuff. At the moment, almost all standards in private rented sector property are based on a local authority turning up and saying, this is below standard, you need to improve it to X. That's not the case with the Decent Home Standard because it's added to the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. And if a local authority officer inspects your property and it's seriously below standard, they can immediately penalise you up to £7,000 for being below standard. So it's really important to be dealing with people who, one, understand this stuff and can give you real advice about whether your property is up to standard or not. Because the reality is if it's your own property, you always feel that it's perfect, but the local authority may not see it the same way. I can tell you stories about what's considered perfect. Just as a hint, if your stairwell is held up by car jacks and bricks, that's not good. Okay, I had to try and convince a client that wasn't acceptable recently and they weren't having it, but really it wasn't. Okay, I'm sure that's none of you. Also, Awaab's law, you've probably heard about this. This exists in the social sector and relates to damp and mold growth, and says that if your property has a damp and mold growth and you're required to inspect it within a fixed time period, that's just about to come into force for the social sector. It's going to be extended to the private rented sector. The government's consulting on it. But what's really important about it is that there's going to be quite tight timelines to actually get inspections done and get works done. And this is where it's really helpful to deal with an agent, because generally speaking, they have a nice little Rolodex full of experts and people who owe them favors who will go around to properties on short notice. Whereas if it's just you with your telephone and the yellow pages or its modern equivalent, it can be somewhat difficult to get someone out there to inspect your property without paying them a vast amount of improbable money. So it's going to require prompt action and expertise. Enforcement, lots and lots of increases, civil penalties for local authorities. Local authorities are going to get seed funding, but the government has been very clear that that's temporary funding, and they expect local authorities to fund increased enforcement activity by penalties. Hopefully not from any of you. So there's a much wider enforcement strategy, and local authorities are now actually obligated to enforce the legislation. At the moment, local authorities don't have to enforce this law. They will be obliged to do so. So they're under a lot of pressure. Tenants can also claim rent repayment orders for mistakes, like not having an HMO license, and they'll be extended from the current 12 months of rent out to 24 months of rent. So there's a real pressure to make sure your paperwork is really clean. You can't hide behind a limited company because they can go after directors. And you can also go after superior landlords. So if you own a block with multiple flats in it, they can come after you for things that people underneath you have done. So it's important to keep an eye on these situations. That's my LinkedIn QR code if you like that kind of thing. And I believe I'm going to answer some questions later.
Now it's our turn. What David did is highlight the challenges and pitfalls of what the Renters' Right Bill is going to offer us as landlords. But now it's down to what solutions we're going to offer you as landlords from an agent perspective, from the infrastructure that we're invested in terms of, again, the compliance management, AI-driven maintenance solution. Our team are working tirelessly to ensure that you're kept ahead of the curve. So I'd now like to welcome Harry Foster and Adam Ray to the stage to provide that presentation for us.
All right, lots of serious faces. I know obviously it's serious talk, but like I said, we're here to talk a little bit more about us, obviously why there's the need to, in the first place, use agents, responsible agents at that, and what we can do in terms of offering a solution to you guys. As Khan said, my name's Harry. I'm the Lettings Director over in our Hampstead office, and my background is mostly I've spent time managing offices in Canary Wharf and also Wapping, so I've seen a real variation in terms of what you'd expect. In Canary Wharf, things to be very clean, sometimes very, very difficult. Some of the tenants you see that come through, they're very good at playing the systems. You have to be very, very careful on what you do there and the type of the tenants you're looking at. And Adam, over to yourself for a bit of intro as well.
Yeah, so my name's Adam. I head up our client services team at David Astbury's. I've got about just over 15 years experience in the industry, working predominantly on the letting side of things from Hampstead. So dealing with properties across north, northwest, central London areas. Obviously, in terms of what we've seen in that period since sort of the late 2000s, we've had a wave of changes, lots of different things, whether it's EICRs, tenant fee ban, all of these different elements to the letting sector. So I've seen those implemented, how landlords have adjusted and continue to be here today as landlords. In terms of what I do now, my current role is speaking to new and existing clients and really understanding what their needs are, their requirements, and how David Astbury's can sort of facilitate that and help with any challenges and really get the most out of rental investments. What we do, myself, my team, we speak to thousands of landlords every week. So as a company, we really have our finger on the pulse in terms of what sentiments are from a range of different landlords. We deal with large sort of corporates with nationwide portfolios, overseas investors, UK-based owners with sort of medium and small size portfolios, all the way through to what you'd probably class as your accidental landlords. So those that may have fallen into being a landlord through inheritance or perhaps sort of buying another property, retaining theirs, and then renting it out, not really knowing what it is to be a landlord and having to mitigate those circumstances. So really today, as Harry said, it's about understanding from your perspective what the challenges are, but then also what the solutions are and how this can be an opportunity and how it's a positive.
And that's it. You know, I think the main thing we're talking about here, David used the phrase earlier, doom and gloom. But I think what we need to remember is this has changed. We've been here before, whether it's, as I said, you know, EICRs in 2020, Tenant Fees Act ban in 20, we've been here before. This is change, but it's not the end of something, it's not the beginning of something else. Rentals will always be rentals. There will always be more people looking for properties and fewer properties. So I think it's, what we're trying to say here is take a minute, take a step back, understand what there is. You know, that's why we're all here, to understand more and to learn more about what we should do to protect both our asset and to get the right tenants, to get those good people in.
So obviously, in terms of who's in the room today, we speak to a lot of you all the time. You're all going to be in very different situations. So you could be that landlord with just a single property. You could be letting that out yourself. You might be a bigger portfolio landlord. But ultimately, what we want to do today, David's obviously kindly laid out what's to come in terms of the changes and what the landscape's going to look like. We're here now to provide you with solutions. And again, you're all going to be very different, but the benefit of coming tonight, dealing with an agent like ourselves, like David Astbury's, being an independent, we can be so agile and we can tailor a package to you and tailor the solutions to fit what you need. So what we want to do today is bring to you some real life examples, what Harry and I have worked on and across the rest of the team in our various branches, so that you can come away from here armed with the knowledge of what you need to do to face what's coming and really get the most out of it. So one of the most common sort of conversations that we have day in, day out with landlords at the moment is the type of landlord who is currently letting their property out, used an agent, used us to find the tenant, but they've been managing that property themselves. Probably done that for many years, very successfully. Every year it seems like there's more and more legislation. Obviously this is quite a big sort of change, as we say, but it's a transition, it's an evolution of the lettings market. In terms of the conversations that we're having now with landlords, it's the time element, it's the bottom line profit, it's kind of, can we maintain our asset and make it profitable, but also mitigate the risk against what's coming in. And I know, Harry, from the letting side, you've had a lot of good examples recently of people coming across that may have been a let-only landlord previously that have then come to us and wanted to release that burden onto an agent and allow us to kind of take that off their hands.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, we had the landlord that Adam introduced me to, and how I always start any conversation with the landlords, I need to understand not just about them and their property, but their priorities, because everyone's different. Everyone has different pressures, different priorities, different things they're looking to get out of property. And for this particular landlords, they just wanted an easy life. You know, they were getting on a little bit, they just moved abroad. So part of my understanding, that initial part is, okay, what do you know about the Renters' Rights Bill? And this was about 6 months ago. And they go to me, what do you mean? What's that? I'm thinking, okay, right, this is going to be a lot, so you better be sitting down. And then I'd let them know exactly what that means and what that entails. And similar as David's done, to educate them a little bit more on what is needed. And you know, what we really set out to do in that situation was the quality of tenant. We need to find the right people for that property. Someone who will ideally not be fussy, not move in and ask for this to be changed, that to be repaired. They need to know and be grateful that they're in that property. So we found that people within a day. We had 4 viewings, we had that perfect offer come in, and we knew that they were right. They were very easygoing. 2 guys, they just said, look, very simply, we just want to work. We don't even care that the carpet's green. So we knew that they must be good tenants. Because if they're willing to take that, I think, you know, they're willing to look past a few things. And soon after we accept those tenants, moved to the contract phase within the first week of signing with them, that landlord did call me again and say, look, I don't even know where to start with the renters' rights, but I don't know really what I should be looking at. I haven't done TDS before. There's a lot of things I haven't needed to do, because for so many of you landlords, there's, you know, that although that information can be found, you have to go and find it. It's not given to you freely and easily. You have to be here on a Wednesday night listening to a sister and a bunch of estate agents to find out that information. So, and these landlords, they didn't have that time. And what we were giving back to them, which is a lot of people, it's how much do you value that time? And for this situation, they thought, you know what, we've been in the game 40 years. I've put off enough headache and hassle. I'd rather value my time more. So Harry, go ahead. You can deal with all of that. Sort out my compliance. They had a lot missing. And that's been managed for 6 months, and they'd never had it managed before. And as of yet, things have been going well, smoothly, and we look to have a long-term relationship with not just that landlord, but with the tenants and the property as well.
And I think something else, a very common sort of situation that we're finding at the moment. So in a similar vein to landlords who manage their own property, it's that type of landlord that has in the past been able to avoid using an agent altogether. So there are obviously a lot of different methods for sourcing your own tenants, various different ways of doing that. And I think something that we've been seeing, so I'm obviously at a much earlier stage of speaking to clients and landlords before they might have to be searching for new tenants, but the sentiment that we're finding now is that the quality of tenant is obviously now so much more valuable than it was in the past. And in order to find that quality of tenant, you can't be doing that in sort of private channels in the same way that you may have used to be able to do that. What we can offer from an agent's perspective, and I think Harry's going to go into some more detail on it, is being able to attract that highest caliber of tenant. And they're not going to go to every landlord, they're not going to go to every agent, they're going to go to the ones that are set up correctly to facilitate their requirements, as much as you as landlords are going to come to the right agent that can meet your needs. So I think it's definitely something that we've seen a huge amount more of landlords who, yes, in the past you may have saved a small percentage with not having to pay that letting commission, but now it's balancing up that return on investment, that risk mitigation for your asset, and maybe looking at using an agent that can find that quality of tenant that's going to provide that security for the long term, which is just so valuable now.
Yeah, look, and as Adam said, quality of tenant. I think that's the name of the game at the moment. You have the right people in the property, because the main change of the bill, as David listed there, is that control. Control has been wrested away from landlords for a few years now, as we've seen with fair, wear and tear, whatever that means subjectively. It's always been moved over to more to the tenant side. So understanding that, right, the tenants have more control, I have less. So I need to get the right people in my property. So how do I find the right people? Right, well then it's all about the qualification. How do I understand where and how to qualify the right people for the right property? It's understanding, are they going to be comfortable? For example, okay, we've got a 2-bed flat that's on the second floor. It's not going to be right for a family because they're not going to want to go up and down. And wear and tear in a 2-bed, it's going to be a little bit worse as well. So what we want to do is understand how to do more in terms of qualifying, because yes, referencing is still and always will be massively important, the credit checks, the landlord reference, the financial checks. But with all of those checks, it's, as you probably will find with all the companies, it's yes or no. Have they paid rental time? Yes. God, I'd hope so. That's the bare minimum these days. And then it doesn't go into enough detail in what you need to understand. You want to understand, what are they like as a person? What are they like to deal with? What are they like when it moves in? Are they going to be difficult? Are they going to be easygoing? Are they going to provide access for viewings? If I look to sell, what's that going to be like? So how we go about finding that is actually, we'll call the landlord. So when a tenant puts in an offer on our property, we'll go and call that landlord. We don't just send them a reference form to fill out. Because quite often you find that if a tenant's maybe not been the best, you will never hear that from a bunch of yes or no questionnaires. So we'll go and have that conversation just to hear how they've been. And we were speaking to a landlord that said, yeah, the tenants, I never spoke to them. Great, that sounds ideal. But she said, yeah, at the deposit stage though, I wish that I continued, that I never spoke to them. And I found out why I'd never spoken to them, because there was a damp problem, a growing damp problem. Now, had it been called at an early stage and the tenants had brought it up, it probably could have been resolved. But instead, went to that 12-month period. The end of that 12-month period, the landlord had to redo the bathroom, and that was seen as fair wear and tear. The landlord couldn't charge the tenants. But had that issue been found, caught, reported earlier, it might never have become a problem in the first place. And that landlord was really surprised, to be honest, that we were willing to have a conversation. And we didn't work with those tenants in the end because we knew, right, that they'll probably do the same. They might be quiet, but any problems that they might hide or just not care about, they might just not understand the cost and the damage that might lead to. And that landlord, as a result, gave her family home to rent with us, and she was one of those landlords who'd rented it through the council. Just thought, yeah, it's easy going. I can pass it over to the council, not see it for 3 years. What I get back probably doesn't look like my property, but it's just easy. And we've now, as of yesterday, actually, they moved in because it was her family home. It was a motive. It wasn't just a property. Her situation was a bit different. She needed someone to really look after it. In 5 years, when she came back from India, she wanted it to still look like her family home. And as a result, we are going to be taking over management of her other 2 properties as well. Like I said, one being with the council and the other being one she rented through open rent, just purely because she had the time and she had the ability to do it, but things have changed.
Hello everyone, I'm Maria from Goodlord. I have worked for Goodlord for 5.5 years. I've worked in the industry for about 13. I've always worked with rent protection. I'm going to go through a little bit about what Goodlord does. I've had a couple of questions from landlords today, so who we are and what supplier we are to David Asprey's. So Goodlord are a prop tech business. So what we do is we provide pre-tenancy software to letting agents. That means that we take care of their compliance on tenancy agreements, on holding deposits, on referencing. We take tenants through that full journey, and David Asprey's choose us because it helps them keep compliant, which I know is something that they've been talking about a lot today. That's why they are partnered with Goodlord. One of the other reasons is that we offer the most comprehensive product that's available on the market for rent protection, which I'm going to talk to you about today. I know we've got a Q&A afterwards, so any questions or anything like that, let me know. I'm hoping I'll be able to answer them. And we'll go through everything now. So I just want to talk a little bit about the challenges. There's been touched on a bit today, but as landlords, there are things that you need to think about, and there are solutions for you too. You've got the Renters' Rights Bill, that's what this evening's been about. You've got to think about supply and demand. So how many tenants are looking to get into your properties? You've got the economic stress. I've talked to one landlord today who says, the taxes have all been going up. There's all these things to think about. And I'm a bit worried about Renters' Rights Bill. I think David Asprey has shown really well today how they're supporting you. This is one of the most fantastic events. They've come to you and they've given you all this information. So if you're using David Asprey's, you don't need to be concerned. You do have compliance burdens, which I've touched on already, and you want to make sure that you're getting the most out of your property, that you're making that money. It is most of the time for anyone else who's anyone else who might be very lucky, but most of the time this is your biggest investment. So this is something that you would, it's a lot more than your holiday that you insure. It's a lot more than your car that you insure. And it gives you that, Jerry's saying no, do you have fancy holidays, Jerry? So what I'm here to talk to you about today is there is no need to be concerned about the solutions that are available. Now, not many people know about the full timeline for the eviction process. I'm going to talk to you about that today, what that looks like today without the changes for the Renters' Rights Bill. So your tenant might go into arrears or refuse to leave the property. Your agent might have to try and mediate with that tenant to understand what's going on, why things have changed. They passed their referencing. So now why maybe are they not able to pay their rent? Why are they refusing to leave? Just by a show of hands, who in this room knows someone who's been made redundant ever? Right? Are they good people? Yes, right? So they are a victim of circumstance. A lot of the time, that's what happens with tenants. They're referenced properly. They're put through the referencing that we provide. They're vetted by David Asprey's, but their circumstances change. And it might mean that they have to stop paying their rent for whatever reason. So in that situation, they stop paying their rent. You're trying to find out what's going on. You then need to serve them with a notice. Now that can be paid for through a solicitor. You're then going to have to go to court. That comes with court costs. You're going to have to pay an advocate to be there. You're going to have to be there. And then you're going to have to be there when the bailiff is there. You're going to have to pay for that bailiff as well. In London, you're talking anywhere between like 4 to 8 months to get a bailiff at the moment. It's a really lengthy process. Now, then you've got the end of tenancy. Then you need to relet the property. On average, in England at the moment, the average eviction time is 10 months. Now that is with the Section 8 notice for rent arrears being 2 months. That's changing to 3 months as we go through. It's also the notice for you to get your property back is moving from 2 months under a Section 21 to 4 months under a Section 8. So that's just going to elongate that process. There's going to be a lot more pressure on the courts. It's going to take a longer amount of time to get your tenants out of the properties, should they go into arrears. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but the pressure is there. So what is included in David Astbury's rent protection service? So that's provided via Good Lord, and this is available to then managed landlords. So what is included? So if a tenant falls into arrears, we will pay the rent until we have vacant possession of the property. There are other products available on the market, Direct Line, for example. They will offer you cover, but it will only offer 12 months worth of payments. Now, the average eviction time in the UK is 10 months. Now, when it elongates and it goes to sort of 12, 14 months, which is very likely to happen, you're going to need to make sure that you've got a product that covers you until we got vacant possession of the property. We will cover the legal expenses to evict that tenant. So we will serve the section notices. As I said on the previous slide, we'll arrange the legal advocate, the court cost, the bailiff. That is all covered under the service that David Astbury's provide. It doesn't have an excess. So again, other products available on the market might carry a 1 month excess. So if your rent on your property is £2,000, £2,500, an excess is a full month's rent. So you've lost that immediately. But under the Good Lord product, it's a nil excess. They also, David Astbury's have a big window to be able to make a claim. So it's 45 days. What that gives you is enough time to be that reasonable landlord that I know that everyone sat in this room is. You are going to try and work with that tenant and understand what's going on, understand that, you know, oh, okay, you've lost your job. Like, what are your options? Are you looking for work? Those sort of things. But if they don't come good on their promise to pay next month, then you've got that option and they've got that time to put that claim in. We also offer up to 6 weeks at 90% of the rent following vacant possession after a claim. So when we've managed to get that tenant out of the property through however that's happened, maybe we've mediated, maybe we have had to serve notice and they've left, or maybe we've had to go the full bailiff experience for them, we will pay you up to 6 weeks at 90% of the rent. Now, it's really important to note that because this is David Astbury's service, you would have to re-let through them to benefit from that. That is that's the main part of our product that we offer, that we've offered for, I think we changed our product in November 2021. So this has been included for quite a long time. What we've seen is a real change in the industry with the Renters' Rights Bill. People are looking for a product that they know is going to support them through all the changes that are coming. So we've done a couple of things and we've improved two things. We've improved two things and added an extra two. We're offering now up to £1,000 on top of the deposit amount towards property damage. So where you have a tenant that's lived in that property and they have they've left damage in the property, the full deposit's used, right? And you know, sometimes, I'm sure unfortunately some of you might have been victim to it, they really go to town on that. Now, we will offer £1,000 on top of that deposit amount to give you that cover, to give you that space to be able to re-let that property, get it back into a lettable state. We have also increased our alternative accommodation and storage for a landlord where they're trying to move back into the property from 30 days to 90 days, because we know it's going to take longer to get tenants out of properties. So if you're a landlord sat in this room thinking one day I'm going to want my property back and I'm going to want to move back into it, we will cover your accommodation and your storage for 90 days while you do so. Now, David and the David Astbury's team, they have gone through the changes for Renters' Rights Bill. And one of the main changes is the Section 13, that if you serve a Section 13 for a rent increase to a tenant, they are able to take you to first tier tribunal. As David said, that is a mechanism that's used, that can be used at the minute. But what it means is if they contest the rent and they say, I don't agree with this increase, and they go to first tier tribunal, it is not backdated even if it's found fair. So what that means is you're sat there needing your rent increase, maybe your mortgage is increased or something similar, and you're not getting that rent from your tenant because they've got no reason to not go through that process. Now, I like to always mention at this point, everyone knows Martin Lewis, hopefully, the money saving expert. This is the sort of thing that will be on his programme. He will say, did you know that if you are not sure on your rent increase, if you don't agree with it, if you can't afford it, just taken to first tier tribunal, because even if it takes 6 months, you've got another 6 months in that property at the rent that was previously agreed. All that sort of thing is going to start to come to the surface as the bill goes live. And then another point that David mentioned is that you can't take any rent in advance. Now, rent in advance is seen usually as 6 or 12 months to make sure that people are comfortable in the property and that you're happy with that tenant. What it actually means is you can't take any rent at all until that tenancy agreement is signed. What we're doing is we're guaranteeing that first month's rent should that tenant sign the agreement, get the keys for whatever reason, and not pay that first month's rent to you. We will pay that out to you within 5 working days. Now, we've changed this product in line with the Renters' Rights Bill. We're trying to make sure that that you as landlords are completely protected. I would welcome feedback on it on the Q&A session. But that is everything that I wanted to go through today. So thank you all so much for listening.
Tribunal focuses very heavily on comparable property, so it tends to be quite good because it also has its own organic expertise. All tribunal rent panels sit with a qualified valuer. It works very well in London and cities where you've got tons of comparable property. You know, it's not hard to find comparable properties for a 3-bed house in this part of London. It's really poor as a system if you go to like rural Norfolk, where you've got like a cottage and then the next rental property is 5 miles that way. And in that situation, it's not a great system. The problem has been that the tribunal has been asked to do more and more and more stuff, and the government progressively cut its funding, so its administration is really bad and really behind. Until recently, the only way you could pay a tribunal fee was with a cheque. I don't know about you guys, I don't even have a checkbook, but from a solicitor's perspective, it's an enormous pain in the arse because obviously businesses don't have checkbooks either anymore. So it was very difficult to pay fees. So their admin has actually fallen behind that court service because they just didn't have that much work. But the amount of work they've had has just gone through the roof as the Housing Act 2004 is better understood by local authorities. As you introduce civil penalties and rent repayment orders, the amount of work's gone up. And what's expected is there'll be another massive step change from the roughly 9,000 Section 13 appeals that you get today up to potentially quite a lot. But no one knows. The problem is that at the moment, relatively few Section 13s are served, and only about 10% of tenants contest the Section 13 because they don't really understand it. But if tenants are better informed about the rights and you all have to serve Section 13 notices, then that potentially changes. And if tech companies on the other side of good lord's equation get involved and say to tenants, well, we can save you money on your rent increase and we'll take 10% of everything we save you, then that changes the game somewhat. And it's those kind of uncertainties that we don't know about. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems with the government, and I actually said this on LinkedIn the other day, that it's not really a housing strategy to tell landlords you hate them all the time. That's not particularly a useful way to go forward. The government's in a bit of a silly position of its own making. I don't have much sympathy for them in that they sat down for a long time in the opposition and said how crap landlords were. They sat there and encouraged activists to get out on the doorstep and get the vote out for Starmer by telling them they were going to get rid of Section 21. They then introduced all of this and they're now sitting going like, maybe we shouldn't have done that, but it's too late. And what's quite interesting in talking to the department at the moment, there's quite a strong disjuncture between what civil servants are telling ministers and what they're prepared to hear, which is unusual. You don't tend to find such an obvious disjuncture between civil servants and ministers, despite what you might read in the paper. They do tend to be much more in line than they currently are in this department. The government...
Have they defined the laws? Have they put out a paper to you guys to be able to defend landlords in these cases where...
There are plenty of defences. I mean...
Would it be worth it for the landlords trying to save...
Yes, and that's why I started with where I was. Most of the... I mean, I was saying to someone during the break, the risks are no different tomorrow than they are now, particularly.
It's just more.
Well, no, I don't think so. The reality is that the tenants who aren't going to pay now, and they're just as much not going to pay tomorrow. It becomes more complicated to evict them, yes, but not so much so that it's impossible. It's not going to necessarily take so much longer that you're going to lose money. There are more insurance products available and coming onto the market, and really far more insurance products and far better insurance products than have ever been available in the past. The quality of legal advice available to landlords is massively improved over what it was even 2 or 3 years ago, because there are more specialists these days. And the underlying economics don't change. So the change really is not the risk, it's your perception of it that's changing. And the risk in practice, I don't think has changed as much as you think it has. I don't know, obviously you can prove me wrong in 2 years' time, we'll find out. But the reality is things change all the time in lots and lots of areas. When people introduced the Tenant Fees Act in 2019, I had numerous agents telling me that their businesses were going to collapse and everything was going to fall apart, and they're still here. Damn it. I mean, obviously great, but and when people introduced the Housing Act 2004 and tenancy deposit protection, I wrote one of the first books on the Housing Act 2004. I remember going to landlord seminars and landlords literally shouting at me about how it was going to ruin their business because they couldn't keep tenants' deposits and go on ski holidays, which, to be fair, is actually what some people did, which is bizarre. And what do you know? There's still landlords. In fact, there's more than there were back then. And I had landlords telling me that HMO licensing was going to ruin their business. It would cost too much money and they were going to have rent repayment orders ripping them apart. But it didn't. So you need to be very careful. Bear in mind, when I present on what the law is, obviously I'm telling you the worst case scenario, because if I didn't, you'd probably try and sue me later. Yeah? So the reality is that I'm not going to tell you that it's all rosy, but it's not necessarily as bleak as you might think. The reality is that the economic position doesn't change that much. There are more people who want houses than there are houses available. It's going to be very, very important going forward to make sure that your administration and your paperwork is better than it's ever been. But that's been true for quite some time.
Interesting to see the people that don't grow.
Yeah, I mean, I think there will be increasing pressure from local authorities on housing standards, for sure. That's the objective.
Which is good.
But in practice, in my experience, the vast majority of good landlords just really don't have anything to worry about. I wasn't joking when I said I'd met people who think that the way to hold up a set of stairs is with a car jack. I see stuff all the time. I just think, like, really? You really think this is a good quality property? I can assure you, you are head and shoulders above. Yeah, but there is a significant number of people in the game that I can assure you would shock you if I told you that they existed. And they're probably not that far away. I mean, let's break that up, because there are several different points. The landlord exodus, and I bear in mind, I used to be the policy director of the Residential Landlords Association, so I used to spend hours going into government saying, oh, if you do this, all landlords will sell. The reality is I wasn't telling the truth. There's no evidence of that. There has been a slow decrease in the available stock and the number of landlords since about 2017. It's hard to say what that's based on. Some of it's attitude, for sure. Some of it is the change in availability of cheap money, and also changes in profiling by banks. But mostly what it's based on is that there was always a certain amount of churn in the sector because landlords were always selling. But what's not happening is there aren't so many people buying. And that also reflects the fact that the demographic of landlords is changing. Older landlords don't tend to be as highly geared on lending as younger landlords. So many younger landlords are much more highly geared with their lending. So if you make cheap money less available, then you have fewer young landlords buying into the sector. But what's also changing is the number of properties people own. At one stage, the RLA, and indeed the NRLA average, was 1.5 properties. It's closer to 4 within landlord associations now. That's a bit higher than the average across the sector, but it's increasing. Now, what I think is really interesting about this, and where I think the government has made a massive mistake, actually, is that I think landlords are changing. And the government is trying to do that. That is their objective. And it was the objective of the previous government as well. It wants landlords to be more professional and to own more properties. So the era of the accidental landlord with one house they inherited off their granny and kept is disappearing, because you'd be better off to sell it. But landlords are therefore professionalizing. But the problem with this is that a professional landlord has a different assessment of risk than an accidental landlord, because they're in the game for a different reason and they're invested in a different way. Accidental landlord didn't cost them anything to get the asset. They don't care whether it makes money or not, as long as it's making money on capital appreciation. And investment landlords got a totally different perspective on that. So what the government has failed to appreciate is if you change landlords, by definition, you're also going to change the people they let to. And that may not be the way you expect. So do I think the PRS is going to change? Yes, absolutely. I think that it's going to move back to what it was originally, which is mostly employed people looking for who can't yet afford a property, or who want a temporary piece of accommodation while they decide what they're doing. So they've moved geographically or something like that, or they're in a new job, or they're changing their life position. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, provided that there are alternatives available. And the problem the government has failed to appreciate is it must put those alternatives on the table, and it's hoping that it will, but that's a lot of hope. Hope's doing a lot of heavy lifting in this sentence. So I think, yes, the market will change. Actually, I started out by pointing out that the PRS has been asked to do lots and lots of things, many of which it's really not that suitable to do. Housing people on benefits is not the ideal use of your private rented sector. It's a really bad use of it, actually. So should those people be moved back to social housing? Is that good for the sector? Yes, probably it is, actually. But will it be painful while we get there? Yes, quite possibly. And will things happen that we didn't expect to happen? There was a whole set of Court of Appeal cases on this back in like 2012.
The PRS database is registration.
It's a national landlord register.
When does that happen?
Don't know.
Only for the market.
No, everyone will have to be signed up all the time. So it's going to come into effect and you will all have a short window to sign up.
You would, right after the tenancy agreement's signed, you would then be able to take the money. So you can take it immediately after. The problem is that what if it doesn't clear or hasn't worked, that sort of thing. Now, David Astbury's used the Goodwill platform. We're changing the way that our system works to help with this. So we've got the product, but really we're hopeful that element of it won't be used too much. What's going to happen is you can ask for the deposit before you sign the agreement. So what we're going to do is ask the tenants to pay the deposit via our platform. They'll pay that, then they will open it up for signing. They sign and then they pay their first month's rent. Otherwise, you've got a situation where, like David said, someone can sign the agreement, it can be legally binding, and they could get the keys, but their Goodwill platform's not going to allow that to happen, which is why customers like David Astbury choose to use it.
But that first month's rent could happen on day by offer the signing.
Yeah, it could so it could happen. So say you signed it now, you could take it immediately after, but you just cannot take it before because it's classed as rent in advance. No, but we have looked into that and not able to do that. So as in, if the agent were to take it and hold it in escrow, no, you're not able to take it at all.
You said deposit, so how much can the deposit be?
So that's unchanged, so it's still 5 weeks.
So you can take 5 weeks, which is effectively your first rent.
You can
It's a tenancy deposit.
You can take the deposit
Yeah,
and then sign. Yeah, and then so should, for example, it never materialise that they pay the first month's rent, which I think is a very unlikely situation, but it could. You've still got that deposit. They've got skin in the game there, whereas they wouldn't if you didn't do it in that way.
Another one of the slight mistakes the government's made. I mean, this is one that the government has said quite correctly there hasn't been a mass evidence of sell-off, but I already said to you that most landlords are completely blissfully unaware that this is happening. One of the things I think is potentially quite scary, or should be scary for the government, is lots of landlords might suddenly get to some point next year, see a billboard and go, oh, everything's changing. I don't fancy that. Then be told, well, you can't serve a Section 21 because your tenancy's for 3 years. But then they'll go and speak to a specialist who'll say, well, unfortunately, the 3-year tenancy no longer exists because there ain't no fixed terms. And you can serve notice if you want to sell, so go right ahead. And tenants who potentially think they've signed up for a fixed term and think they're secure won't be. This is something that for example, embassies in London are really, really annoyed about. So a lot of embassy staffers take 3-year +1 tenancy, so 3 years with an option to renew for a 4th year, depending on the country, because they have different periods of time that they're here for. But there are reasons for that. You know, obviously they want schooling and stuff, but there's also security reasons because they have to check the properties for security before they let them move in. So they want some certitude.
Some tenants are actually losing their rights.
It is a problem for a number of tenant groups, and the point has been made to government that there are lots of people who want some certainty. And then what the government is saying is, well, you've got 12 months, and it's only if the landlord sells or wants to move back in themselves. But landlords sell all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, if we're talking about a reconfiguration of the market, then landlords may well adjust their portfolios to buy in different areas or buy different property types. And so I don't think the government has necessarily thought it through. But the problem is, if you turn it around and say, oh, you can have a fixed term if the tenant asks for it, then it's a loophole, isn't it? You're just opening up a situation where you say to the tenant, do you want a fixed term or what, mate? Or else, or else you could do one. So you end up in this terrible position where there's no good answer to the problem. As soon as you're going to get rid of all fixed terms, and you've got to get rid of all fixed terms, you can't have a structure where there's a way around it because someone will exploit it. I mean, there are lots of ways around it. That's the difference.
Thank you, Luca. I think that's enough questions for tonight. We will be here till 9:30 this evening, so if there's any other questions you lot would like answered, please take it. By the looks of it, you've really got this tonight.
I'll go home.
Ask Maria.
But thank you all so much.